And it is 11:30 on today, the 16th of February 2021. Very warm welcome on behalf of the European Liberal Forum to the first edition of Dare to Debate in 2021. And indeed, it's a most important, most topical issue that is unfortunately not discussed enough, which we're going to talk about today. And that is the future of due diligence in Europe. So, finding European solutions to joint challenges um, and finding solutions for a liberal future in a united Europe is the key topic of the European Liberal Forum, the official think tank and foundation of the liberals in Europe, the ALDE party in Europe. Together with our 47 members across all Europe, we try to find those solutions. And one of the solutions that we have to talk about today is how we deal with due diligence. And as we all know, due diligence has been established as a UN guiding principle on businesses and human rights as procedure enabling companies to put their responsibility to respect human rights into practice, including by preventing and mitigating human rights abuses in their global operations and value chains. But what ultimately boils down to is ethical, personal, and societal questions. If your phone is manufactured with slave labor in China, should you be able to buy it? If your solar panels or electric car rely on child labor, should they be sold in the EU? Should we accept media resources that have been partially financed by regimes with horrendous human rights abuses, with a direct negative effect on freedom of media and speech in our domestic markets? Disney. The EU is more than simply a market. It also represents and defends specific values and objectives on the world stage: human rights, democracy, environmental protection, sustainable development, among others. At a time where these values are under attack, both at home but also abroad, it is important that the EU stands up in defense of those values. So the Commission and the EP's initiatives on enhanced corporate responsibility are part of this effort, making sure that businesses, growth, and social development indeed go hand in hand. So companies have a responsibility regarding the supply chains. Let's be quite clear about that. They have to ensure it does not rely on forced or child labor, fuels corruption, or leads to environmental damage. And that is something that's not guaranteed. I remind you that, for instance, in Germany, up until the 90s, corruption abroad was tax deductible. This responsibility goes beyond ensuring that companies comply with high standards. They must ensure their local contractors and partners do so as well through a duty of due diligence. Many European companies subscribe to that vision. Most of them do. The idea that Western companies conducting exploitative or harmful practices in far off countries must be very nuanced because the picture is wrong on the global scale. However, it's important that we talk about that. They can, uh, in a lot of cases, be a lot more respectful of human rights than local companies. They contribute to development, they create jobs, they have a positive effect on human and labor rights, they ensure the future of the children of the people who work in those companies, in those markets. Yet consumers are also increasingly conscious of the impact of their choices and that they can have, and aware of the change they can bring about. For this to happen, they need to be properly informed about companies' practices and trust that the products and services they purchase have been produced in a way that complies with those values that we take too often for granted. A number of initiatives have been taken, but the question remains if they are sufficient or if EU diligence obligations would provide for a level playing field between companies, which distorts sometimes competition. A legal level playing field also could bring certain legal certainties. But for a level playing field, the EU framework must be wide in scope so as to cover many sectors. Enforcement and penalties should be as much uniform for all companies as possible. Third country companies active in the EU market should be included. But how could a proportionate regulatory burden look like? Which violations should be targeted, as companies cannot be liable for everything that happens outside the purview? How do we strike a balance so it does not lead to increased prices for EU consumers and lower investment for foreign populations? So these are just some of the questions that today we want to dare to debate. We have a couple of fantastic guests that I already would like wholeheartedly thank for joining us today. But more importantly, for me at least, I have my fantastic colleague, Lauren Mason, who is leading us through today's debate. She will dare to debate. She will dare to ask some questions, but it's something that we all should do. We all should dare to debate respectfully. So without any further ado, thank you all for joining today. And Lauren, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lauren Mason. Today, we've got three excellent panelists and three deliberately controversial statements that we're going to be debating around the question of due diligence in an attempt to get to the core of the discussion when we're talking about human rights, environmental standards, as Daniel mentioned, and how to also recognize that we're in the middle of an economic slump caused by COVID-19 pandemic, which is probably going to last for a few more years yet. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists this morning. We have Pascal Durand, MEP for the Renew Europe group from France, who sits on the Committee of Legal Affairs and Constitutional Affairs. We have Pedro Oliveira, who is the Director of Legal Affairs at Business Europe, and Dr. Franziska Humbert, Manager for Corporate Social Responsibility from Oxfam, the member of the Cora network in Germany, and a member of the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. Thank you, all of you, for joining us this morning. I'm going to introduce just a few house rules before we get started on the debate. So you'll notice that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. Something else important is that we have live interpretation into French and English. So if you would like to listen in French, you see right at the bottom of your panel a sort of globe that says interpretation, and there you can choose your language. And a point about asking your questions, you'll see that there's a Q&A box right at the bottom of your screen. We will have a Q&A section later on in today's webinar, so please feel free to type your questions there. You can also upvote questions that have been asked by other people. And if you have any technical questions, you can put those in the chat and someone from our team will help you out. Something else that we will be asking you to get involved in is some voting. So we have three questions we will be asking you at the beginning and at the end of each section, how you feel about the statements, whether you're in favour or against, and we'll see whether any of your opinions change throughout the debate today. So I think without further ado, we can get started on the first of our three debates. For this debate, the statement is as follows. Due diligence is simply an extension to human rights and environmental harm of the processes that are already applied by companies when identifying defective products. So we're saying that companies already have procedures in place for identifying products that are faulty, and in due diligence, all we're asking them to do is to extend those processes so that they cover human rights and environmental harm. So the polling is open. You should have the chance now to vote yourselves whether you're in favour or against this question. We'll see how the audience feels. Oh, it's quite a close one.
Merci. J'imagine que c'est à moi. Donc je m'exprime en français et je remercie évidemment d'avoir accepté cette interprétation. Les mots sont toujours à choisir avec prudence parce que c'est dans la nuance que ces sujets vont évoluer. C'est dans la nuance qu'on va arriver à faire un large consensus, à la fois avec les entreprises, les ONG, les consommateurs et évidemment les populations locales qui sont concernées. Donc, je préfère m'exprimer en français pour être sûr de ne pas dire de bêtises. Je vais peut-être en dire, mais au moins, ça ne sera pas à cause d'un mauvais choix de termes. La question qui est posée, en fait, c'est évidemment une excellente question et elle est née dans ma tête, dans ma réflexion, d'un débat que j'ai eu avec le MEDEF français, donc la partie française de Business Europe, qui m'expliquait sur la chaîne de valeur, sur le fait de ne pas aller trop loin dans la chaîne de valeur, dans la chaîne des responsabilités, dans la chaîne des déclarations, au motif qu'on ne pouvait pas aller toujours vérifier ce qui se passe chez un sous-traitant. Et l'argument avait été de me dire, que j'entends évidemment, Airbus, grande société industrielle aéronautique, a près de 10 000 sous-traitants. Et j'entends évidemment cet argument. Et on ne peut pas contrôler les 10 000 sous-traitants, etc. Et pourtant, la réponse qui m'est venue spontanément et naturellement, la réponse est oui. C'est-à-dire que Airbus a 10 000 sous-traitants, mais si demain un avion s'écrase parce qu'un boulon a été mal fixé, parce qu'il y a eu telle erreur dans la conception, en aucune manière Airbus va pouvoir dire « Ah ben oui, non mais attendez, je ne suis pas responsable, c'est la faute de mon énième sous-traitant, etc., qui a mal construit le boulon. » Non, il y a un contrôle de sécurité qui est fait de A jusqu'à Z, et Airbus, comme d'ailleurs pour d'autres sujets, si un enfant s'empoisonne avec un jouet ou autre, évidemment, le distributeur ou l'importateur européen ne va pas pouvoir dire « Ah oui, non mais attendez, c'est au Vietnam qu'on a mal fabriqué. » Donc la question qui se pose, et c'est une question absolument majeure, c'est celle du contrôle sur l'ensemble de la chaîne de valeur pour les questions humaines et environnementales au même niveau que pour les questions de sécurité ou de qualité matérielle. Et on peut parfaitement arriver, c'est une volonté. Quand on parle du textile, par exemple, il est évident qu'un grand groupe textile va vérifier la qualité du coton qui sert à fabriquer ses vêtements, ses chemises. Et donc, il va avoir cette chaîne de contrôle et il le fait pour la qualité. Eh bien, il est actuellement en réflexion et demandé qu'il puisse le faire, que la vie d'un enfant, l'exploitation d'un travailleur forcé ou je ne sais quelle destruction de forêt à l'autre bout de la planète a une valeur pour l'entreprise, comme pour évidemment l'ensemble des consommateurs et l'ensemble des parties prenantes, a une valeur aussi importante que celle de la qualité. Donc on ne demande pas plus, on ne demande pas d'aller évidemment fabriquer soi-même, on demande à ce que la chaîne de contrôle et de responsabilité soit de la même nature que sur la production et la qualité. C'est ça qui est recherché. Voilà, et je tiens mes 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Durand. So we heard it, nothing extra is required of companies other than what they already have in place to check their supply chains and the quality of their products. Now, I think there's somebody who's prepared to speak against that. Pedro, you have the floor to tell us why that's not the case.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thanks for ELF for inviting Business Europe to this important debate. And I'll jump straight to it. But first, I just wanted to bring some clarification on the position of Business Europe around these issues, especially around due diligence. We just adopted a position to follow the Commission or to reply to the Commission public consultation that just took place. And for us, it's very important for the EU to have this kind of global leading role. I think this in terms of these due diligence questions, this is an important. It's quite important. And from our point of view, a EU framework could have some advantages provided that some conditions are met. And in that paper, we explain those conditions, which run from the terminology used, the legal certainty, the scope, articulation with other EU law, and something that I think it was either you or Daniel before who mentioned the level playing field to avoid that we end up with a patchwork of rules. So to have this workable system, there's a lot of work that will be required to assimilate it or to compare it to a situation of or to a legal framework on product safety and effective products. I think it's rather simplistic, with all due respect to Mr. Durand, but it's a little bit simplistic, given that at the end of the day, Due diligence is about the process in itself. It's not only about the specific product. So there is here a difference in terms of the scale. So we're not only talking about one product, we're talking about the overall activities of the company in the value chain, which implies the behavior of other actors. There's an issue, a difference in terms of the scope as well, because services might also be included when we're talking about a due diligence framework. The nature of the obligations. There's the example of Airbus, of course, with airplanes. I mean, there's specific legislation on this. There's product liability at EU level. This is pretty well defined, especially in the aviation sector. When it comes to due diligence, we're going much broader than that. So, because at the end of the day, the acts of companies, any act can produce effects in the value chain, whether positive or negative. So at the end of the day, the nature of the obligations differ quite substantially. Also, in the beginning, Daniel mentioned that this is also an issue about values, ethics, and this goes beyond also the simply safety of people. This also goes about human rights and environment as well. And then, my last point, unlike with defective products, a due diligence framework is one where the companies that we imagine that the European measure will not cover certain types of companies, depending on their size, they will still have it imposed on them. So unlike with the product safety regime or a product liability regime, a new diligence framework could have implications because they will be basically spilling over to companies in the chain that would not, in legal terms, be covered by the regime. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Okay, so on reverse, we heard that processes for due diligence are not always the same as the processes that we might have in place for products in terms of scale and in terms of nature. Pascal, would you like to react on that in 2 minutes?
Très brièvement, bien sûr, puisque c'est du contradictoire que naîtra la réponse. Il est évident que l'évolution, ce n'est pas un bouleversement, je répète, c'est l'évolution. Quand on dit, par exemple, que sur la chaîne de valeur, on doit vérifier la qualité du coton, pour reprendre un exemple que j'ai évoqué tout à l'heure, c'est simplement considérer maintenant que la manière dont on produit ce coton a la même importance ou la même valeur que la qualité du produit. Et c'est ça la logique, c'est de dire si je fais travailler des enfants, si je fais travailler des esclaves pour produire mon coton, alors sa qualité substantielle n'est pas bonne. Et exactement comme si c'était le coton en lui-même qui n'était pas, je veux dire, utilisable. Et donc, il ne s'agit pas d'une nouveauté, il s'agit tout simplement d'étendre la capacité des entreprises à peser sur un sujet et de l'étendre, encore une fois, avec la même responsabilité. Une entreprise qui vend des vêtements est responsable du produit qu'elle vend, mais elle n'est pas responsable évidemment de la récolte du coton en tant que telle vis-à-vis du consommateur. Et il y a donc une chaîne de responsabilité. Notre problématique, et elle est juridique, c'est d'arriver à faire en sorte que cette chaîne de valeur, cette chaîne de commandement, cette chaîne de sous-traitance soit une chaîne qui soit opposable à l'ensemble des parties prenantes. Voilà. C'est-à-dire qu'on n'arrive pas sur une zone de non-droit, on parlait de sécurité juridique, de manière à ce que les victimes de ces drames, évidemment, que peuvent être la déforestation, les minerais du sang ou autres, soient en capacité de se défendre et d'être considérés finalement comme aussi important que la qualité intrinsèque du produit. Voilà, c'est ça l'évolution. Ça n'est pas une rupture, c'est une évolution.
Thank you, Pascal. Okay, so it's all about how we define quality and how we see the evolution of our understanding of quality. Pedro, would you like to react on that for 2 minutes?
Well, very, very briefly, I mean, I think whatever the due diligence will be an evolution. Will be an evolution from an ensemble of different regimes, EU regimes. We have the non-financial reporting, which is at the level of reporting and transparency, and we have other sectoral regimes. So whatever will come out will be an evolution. What my point of view is that this evolution is not necessarily only focused on the product, because and also at the end there was a little bit of a difference. When you are verifying the product, you have the product in your hands, so you can test its quality, and you can still determine a bit the risks that you are passing on forward. When it comes to violations around the production and the transport and the maneuvering of that product, there's a bit of more asymmetry of information, and some companies do not have access to some information for all different reasons, because the value chains are very complex, especially beyond the different layers. So, and also the leverage that they have to obtain the information is quite different. So at the end of the day, I agree with Mr. Durand that it's about an evolution, but not necessarily saying that it's a simple evolution from the departure of safe products and defective products.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've heard those speaking in favor and those against. Franziska, I would like to give you the floor for 3 minutes to comment on the discussions that you've heard so far.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. I think I agree and disagree with both. First, yes. First, of course, I mean, companies should care as much about their workers as about the products. But I think too, I agree with Pedro, this is maybe too simplistic. Because due diligence is much more than this. Due diligence is giving to do justice to the many human rights victims that exist around the world, around in global supply chains. So it's really to give them access to justice. I also disagree a little bit with Pascal, because I think it's not only about control, as I understand him rightly, it's more than that. It's companies should take due diligence everywhere they can, everywhere they have leverage, everywhere any damage is foreseeable, everywhere they can prevent harm. And then with regard, I disagree with Pedro, because I think there is not really a difference with regard to information. I mean, nowadays in the media, you have all sorts of information. You have the access and the means to be informed, and actually companies are informed what happens to their supply chains. Companies as Lidl, Aldi, Chibo, all the German companies, they go to the countries of the suppliers, they look after them, they take already, they exert due diligence. So I think there is the fact that the product comes here to Germany, to Europe, doesn't make any difference, and it's due diligence is overdue.
Thank you very much, Franziska. Thank you. Before I turn back to the audience to vote again on this question, do either Pascal or Pedro want to come in with a final remark on this topic? If not.
Juste le mot, c'est sur le mot contrôle. Il est clair que le devoir de vigilance, quand Francesca dit qu'elle n'est pas d'accord avec moi, ça doit aller au-delà du contrôle. Quand Airbus contrôle la qualité de ses boulons sur un sous-traitant, etc., il agit. C'est-à-dire qu'il est en mesure de vérifier, etc. Donc le devoir de vigilance, ça part d'abord du contrôle des informations qui sont données. C'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'il y a des enfants qui travaillent, est-ce que, etc. Et si la réalité démontre qu'il y a, alors dans ce cas-là, on doit agir. Mais je pense que ça n'est pas une erreur de dire qu'il doit y avoir contrôle. C'est le fait de laisser faire qui est contraire au devoir de diligence et de diligence. Donc c'est très important de pouvoir vérifier, contrôler et ensuite de pouvoir agir.
Good. Okay, so with that, we will reopen the vote to the audience. Let's see, on the first vote, you were 50-50, so a perfect split. Let's see if there have been any changes after listening to our 3 interventions. Okay, the votes are coming in. It's looking quite close again. Let's see. So it looks like people are slightly shifting towards saying that there is not a simple extension of the practices that are already in place, that there are a few more subtleties involved in setting up procedures for due diligence. So good to know. All right. So Pedro, it seems that you were quite convincing after all. Very good. Okay. So I think with that, we can pass on to the next proposition. Proposition number 2, we will be discussing the statement. Parent companies in the EU must be accountable for corporate violations of human rights incurred abroad, since local judicial systems are often too weak to ensure effective remedy. So that means that when violations or abuses happen somewhere in the work of EU companies abroad, that they should be responsible and held responsible in the EU, since sometimes the local justice structures in the companies where the violation occurred are not strong enough to make sure that the victims get the correct remedy. So before we open the debate, I will open again the vote. And audience, let us know what's your instinct, what's your reaction on this question? How do you feel about it? So it looks like this one might be a bit more clear-cut than the first one. Just waiting for the final votes to come in. So we can see that 87% of people do believe that parent companies in the EU must be held accountable, and just 13% believe that they should not necessarily be responsible for abuses that occur abroad. So let's get stuck into the debate then. We have Franziska, who will be speaking in favor of this statement, and we have Pedro, who will be speaking against. So Franziska, I give you the floor for your first 3 minutes introduction.
Thank you very much. To start with, I want to make clear that parent companies and buying companies are already liable under current law. We have seen this not only in the Shell case last week before the UK court, but already also before German courts, such as in the KIK case. And also there are now penal proceedings where the German company TÜV is involved. That was a case in Brazil, so the broke of the Brumadinho Dam. But currently there is not much legal certainty, because in these cases, most of the times, foreign law will be applied. So for example, Pakistani law in the KIK case. And this makes cases so uncertain, because, and the judges are obviously not used to this. So we urgently need a law under European law to have legal certainty. And this means also we need to make a change to current provisions under international private law to actually make sure that European law will be applied. So yes, parent companies, not only parent companies, but also buying companies with supplier relations to the global south must be held accountable for human rights violations abroad. And I experience this. National systems do not offer any help sometimes. I personally experienced this in Ecuador and Costa Rica, where almost no official, it is governmental investigation exists on the use of pesticides and their fatal health and often lethal consequences. I experienced this in the banana and the pineapple industry. And our numerous investigations there on labor conditions, when I often visited actually Costa Rica, I spoke to a lot of people who lived in the neighborhood of pineapple plantations where they suffered from those pesticides but could not get any legal redress because no official investigations on the harm of those pesticides exist. The same you can experience in Ecuador. There is a school full of disabled children among banana plantations, but there's no any legal redress available. But most importantly, I think parent companies here, and buyers are shall not only held accountable because national systems are too weak, but because they actually contributed to these human rights violations. I think they have to be held accountable because this is where the power, the money lies. They take decisions over life and death, well-being, and a sustainable livelihood. So there should be actually a means to hold them accountable. So I think, to conclude in simple terms, everyone has in the end to stand up for his debts, even if they happen on a pineapple or on a banana plantation, in terms of human rights violations miles away. Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. Okay, so we're lacking legal certainty. We might be lacking legal redress when we let local courts handle these issues. And you also talked about the idea of extending these systems not just to EU parent companies, but also to buying companies. Okay, let's see what Pedro has to say in opposition to this statement. Pedro, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Franziska. So from our perspective, we, of course, companies which are directly responsible for breaches, they should be charged according to the national legislation. I mean, if all the natural or typical law concepts of guilt and nexus of causality and damage, if they are fulfilled, they need to be brought to justice. I mean, this is not, it goes without question. I think in a way this the statement is like the first statement, a little bit simplistic, if I may say so, because at the end of the day, I mean, addressing the weaknesses of local judicial systems is not just a solution to put the liability on companies. I mean, I think the solution or the problem requires a more holistic and in a different type or a more complete type of approach. So from our point of view, we need to understand as well that companies, I mean, when they're investing around the world, they want to do it in an ethical and sustainable way, but they are often confronted also with the lacks of information, as I mentioned before, and also the weak legal situation also on the ground. So we think that addressing these weaknesses should also be about pushing the EU to work together with the international organizations to promote an uptake of the United Nations guiding principles. So that's one point. Doing some improving the local judicial systems, so creating backing up those judicial systems. Then we should not forget that companies are not states, so we should not mix the role of companies and states. Companies are not supposed to police and also to sanction the behaviors of private entities in third states. I think this is important to stress because it's not their function and they are not equipped to do so. They can play a role, they can address, mitigate the risks, but they are not a legal authority or an authority to do some of these things. And then finally, it's also important to take account of very important principles of company law, which is legal autonomy. And I'm reaching the end of my statement, which is that companies cannot be made liable for acts of autonomous entities when they have no say or no control on those entities. Some of subsidiaries of European companies are established in third countries under the foreign company law. And if at a certain point we say that EU company law has precedence over third state company law, then I think this might raise also some eyebrows in terms of WTO rules. So, and also extraterritoriality of EU law. So these issues need to be taken into consideration, and whatever happens, a new accountability and liability system should be really, and this I agree with Franziska, needs to be involved in legal certainty, but designed in a way that doesn't end up discouraging companies from engaging in other markets.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. Okay, so it's about remembering that companies are not states. They don't have the same remit or the same kind of powers. Perhaps the EU should focus more on working with actors on the ground to strengthen the legal systems and to strengthen the adherence with the UN guiding principles, and that companies shouldn't solely be held responsible for these kind of failures, let's say. Okay, Francisca, you have a chance to react on Pedro's comments if you'd like to do so. You're muted, Francisca. Great.
Sorry. Yes, of course. I agree. Companies are not states, but everyone has to take over his responsibility. So national systems, but also companies have to be responsible and have to be held liable if they contributed to the harm. And as I said, it's not only because national systems are weak that companies have to be held liable, but it's also because actually they are also responsible. They contributed to the harm in many cases. Shell is one example in Nigeria, but also, and we I wrote, as Oxfam, we wrote a lot of studies on this. For example, supermarkets with their price policies, they also contribute to this often miserable labor conditions in countries abroad, because actually producers can't really afford to pay higher wages. And actually companies recognize this and accept this. They do care about the supply chains. In our supermarket scorecard, Lidl and Aldi are now actually taking over their responsibility. They're doing risk analysis. They're doing human rights impact assessment. They go to the countries. They meet with trade unions. They actually want to prevent the harm. And certainly, if to the legal questions, we have international law here. So states are under a responsibility to actually implement human rights. And they also have this responsibility with regards to human rights violations abroad. This is stated in various international legal documents. And also, there is also a study commissioned by the European Union already 10 years ago, from 2008, who actually foresaw the possibility to pierce that corporate veil. That corporate veil doesn't stand against the possibility to hold companies accountable if company law is in theory against this. And we have also in other laws many examples that the corporate veil can be pierced. We have this in antitrust law and in many other legal areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisca. Okay, so it's about looking at where the origin of these problems come from in the first place and recognizing that sometimes these legal problems only exist because of actions of some companies, we could say. Pedro, what do you think about that?
I agree with Francisca that there's already a lot that is being done by companies. So companies are going to the source and to the ground, on the ground, to try to solve the problems, identify the problems. This is not only in the retail sector, but it's also occurring in other areas of our economy, and they are trying to make a difference. Of course, it all boils down as well to legal principles that make our legal tradition in the EU. Which revolves around concepts of the legal liability, how you construe the legal liability. The OECD guidelines, they provide some good guidance on how to establish this legal liability, but at the end of the day, we also need to base ourselves in some of our legal traditions and to be careful as well not to enter in a situation where we breach WTO rules. Because, as I mentioned in the beginning, if we overpose our law to other people's law, it probably is not well accepted from the other side. So this is what I can say at this stage.
Thank you, Pedro. Okay, so it's about recognizing as well the broader legal framework and considering, for example, the WTO rules that are already in place. Before I give the floor to Pascal to comment on that, I've seen that there's a question that is directed directly to you, Pedro, so I will take that now. Alejandro Garcia says, Pedro, you mentioned that businesses should not be held accountable for actions of foreign companies outside of their control. Does this mean, conversely, that you would agree that they should be liable for harm caused by companies controlled abroad? So should they be held liable if they do control those companies abroad?
I mean, to address it, of course, every case is a different case. So this, you need to look at the specific case. There are concepts on cause, contribute, link to, so very specific legal terminology that is used for the judges to attribute the responsibility. So this is a question that is more left to the judges to decide under the existing legal traditions in the EU civil liability schemes. So that's what I can say on this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So Pascal, I would like to give you the floor for 3 minutes or so if you would like to comment and react on the discussions that you've heard around Statement 2.
Oui, bien sûr, j'ai un commentaire qui n'est pas simplement un commentaire. C'est la question de la responsabilité, d'ailleurs, elle est directement liée à la question précédente. C'est-à-dire que, encore une fois, si on est responsable que de ses propres actes, c'est-à-dire si on considère qu'on ne peut pas être responsable des filiales ni des éventuels sous-traitants, alors dans ce cas-là, je répète, c'est exactement la même chose pour les produits. Arrêtons-nous juste au niveau 1 et ne soyons pas responsables des autres. Or, ça n'est pas le cas. Donc, je persiste à dire qu'il y a un alignement du droit de l'environnement et des droits humains sur ce que le business as usual fait pour les produits. Mais ce qui est très important, et la question vient d'être posée, c'est quelle est la nature du contrôle? Il y a deux types de contrôle. Parfois, ils se recoupent, mais il y a le contrôle juridique et le contrôle économique. Il est clair que sur une chaîne de valeur, ce qui est important, d'abord et avant tout, c'est qui a la capacité de commander et de payer et qui, in fine, fait le profit. Et donc, lorsque on vient m'expliquer qu'on ne peut être directement responsable que soit de sa propre action, soit celle de ses filiales directes, c'est complètement nier la réalité de la dépendance économique. Et par ailleurs, il est évident que lorsqu'une marque vend un produit, elle le vend sous sa dénomination. Et donc, on voit exactement ce qui se passe avec le travail forcé des Ouïghours. Il est clair que si Nike ou d'autres font fabriquer des produits par des esclaves ou des quasi-esclaves, etc., ils sont directement responsables car ils ont la capacité de suivre la chaîne d'approvisionnement et rien n'oblige. Moi, personnellement, je ne sais pas comment agir sur la Chine. Je sais que beaucoup de gens ont beaucoup de solutions. Moi, je n'en ai pas sur un plan politique. En revanche, sur un plan économique, je sais qu'une entreprise européenne ou américaine peut ne pas travailler dans des conditions qui sont contraires alors, aux règles internationales, et c'est là où c'est très, très important d'avoir un référentiel partagé, les principes directeurs de l'OCDE, l'ODD, les règles de l'OMC, ça fait un cadre juridique partagé, et les entreprises doivent le respecter dès lors qu'elles ont la capacité d'agir, de commander, ou de ne pas commander, ou de ne pas payer. Voilà, et c'est en ça que c'est très important. La question de la responsabilité est évidemment une question majeure.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, there's a certain amount of economic dependence within companies, and they do have an oversight of various steps if they wish to do so. Francisca or Pedro, would you like to react with any concluding remarks on the Statement 2?
Yeah, thank you. Just a note on that WTO mention. We assessed a possible German mandatory supply chain law, and we came to the conclusion that it's not against the WTO rules because, first of all, it is a legal obligation on companies here in Germany or in Europe. And even in the case, if you thought that it would be against the non-discrimination rules, then there could be an excuse under GATT Article 20 where there are human rights exceptions. Maybe the second one, the common legal framework is obviously the UN United Nations guiding principles on business on human rights, and I think every country is under an obligation. Even though it's maybe soft law, but it is evolving, to implement those rules. And these rules are very instructive, even if it's the case, even if Chinese suppliers are involved, because the UNGP says companies should do what is under their, what they are able to, what is possible for them, and they even should work together with others to implement human rights to the extent they are able to. So I think we have here we have clear legal frames. We have the rich body of human rights legislation from the human rights treaty body. So I think, yeah, we just have to apply this. And this is why we also need this new, but we're happy about this new EU legislative proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisca. Pedro, did you want to reply on that?
Very, very quickly. So indeed, and I agree with Mr. Durand, the legal liability question, the legal responsibility is a central question to the whole story of EU action in the coming months. So this is something that we'll definitely look very carefully. Mr. Durand also mentioned the economic aspect and the economic measure that companies can do, but just to add that not all companies have this leverage to impose and to demand and even to access the information that would enable them to take action. So I would just put this out there that we cannot compare Nike with a company in France or in Germany with 100 or 200 employees, which is just providing one part of a wider chain. So I think this also has to be taken into account.
Okay, thank you very much, Pedro. What we're going to do now is reopen the vote for the responses to statement number 2. So the poll should be opening now. How do you feel now about the second statement? What are the votes looking like? Let's see. So the final vote's just coming in. And so I will close the vote now. Interestingly, there's been a slight decrease in the number of people who said that they were in favour of this statement. We had 87 at the beginning, and this has gone down to 71. So maybe there have been some more nuances brought into the discussion. How do we define whether companies are following WTO rules or not? How can we decide what's possible and reasonable for companies to know about, and how to take action on those? Good. So we will close the vote, and now we will move on to the third statement that's up for discussion today. Statement number 3 is as follows. Due diligence legislation would add an extraordinary burden on European companies who are only trying to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. So this one is particularly important for the timing of the legislation that's coming up for discussion. As we know, we are unfortunately in the middle of an economic slump. Many companies have suffered from lockdowns, and from the results of the COVID-19 crisis is now the right time to develop this due diligence legislation and to perhaps put some more burden on companies in that respect. Speaking in favour is Pascal, speaking against is Francisca. Pascal, I'd like to give you the floor first. Oh, sorry, first of all, no, we need to do the vote, sorry. So the vote is now open. What does the audience feel about this statement? Are you in agreement or are you against? Let's see. Also quite a controversial one. So we have 47 people, 47%, sorry, in favour of the statement that it would just add an extraordinary burden to European companies recovering from COVID, and just a slight majority with 53% saying it wouldn't. So with that, I would now hand over the floor to Pascal to begin his introduction.
Oui, merci beaucoup. C'est toujours le jeu des questions-réponses et elles sont évidemment réductrices parce qu'elles sont binaires et elles sont dans un oui ou un non. Et sur ce sujet-là, alors c'est la règle du jeu et donc on l'accepte. Bon, donc je défends une thèse qui en réalité n'est pas vraiment la mienne dans le sens où cette question-là est vraiment, enfin tout le reste aussi sont des questions très importantes. Mais je comprends qu'on soit à 50-50 parce qu'en réalité, évidemment, la crise sanitaire, la crise du Covid crée des difficultés économiques majeures pour un certain nombre d'entreprises, de secteurs. C'est une évidence. Il y a des millions de gens qui sont en train de souffrir à travers la planète dans des conditions terribles. Et les budgets des États essayent, le plan de relance européen, etc., essayent d'aider et d'accompagner. Donc, ça serait, j'allais dire, totalement être en dehors de la réalité de dire que la crise sanitaire ne change rien à la situation des entreprises actuellement et qu'il ne faut pas l'intégrer. Ça, c'est une chose. Après, l'autre chose, c'est qu'une législation n'a pas vocation à être juste conjoncturelle à un moment donné compte tenu d'un contexte. Elle a vocation, et on l'a dit tout à l'heure, à s'inscrire dans une évolution, dans le rôle de l'entreprise, dans le rôle social de l'entreprise, dans le fait que les questions humaines, environnementales sont devenues majeures et que l'entreprise est un acteur, est une actrice de ce domaine-là. Donc, il faut arriver à trouver cet équilibre. Et moi, simplement, ce que je voudrais dire dans la réflexion qui est la nôtre et la réflexion qui est autour de cette législation, rejoint d'ailleurs ce qu'a dit tout à l'heure M. Pedro Oliveira. Il faut savoir distinguer, quand on fait une bonne législation, ceux qui peuvent la mettre en œuvre facilement de ceux qui ont besoin de temps ou qui ne peuvent pas immédiatement avoir les structures nécessaires et qui, oui, elles seraient confrontées à des tâches administratives ou des tâches juridico-économiques qu'elles ne pourraient pas peut-être totalement assumer. Je ne confonds pas le vendeur de vêtements d'une grande ville en France ou en Allemagne avec H&M ou bien sûr que non, bien sûr que non. En revanche, il est très important de raisonner, et c'est pour ça qu'il faut être, et je terminerai là-dessus, il faut être très pragmatique sur ces sujets-là. Il y a des secteurs à risque, le secteur du textile, le secteur de la déforestation, on ne va pas tous les lister, mais il y a des vrais secteurs à risque. Il faut les identifier, et là, on ne peut pas dire que ça ne concerne que les grands groupes, et puis il y a des secteurs moins à risque, où là, il faut essayer de garder, on va dire, la possibilité d'accompagner les entreprises. Je pense que le mouvement ne s'arrêtera pas, mais je pense aussi qu'il faut trouver des étapes et le faire de manière pragmatique.
Thank you, Pascal. Okay, so we heard that a dose of pragmatism is needed in identifying perhaps which sectors are most at risk, and in thinking as well about the long-term impact of this legislation, that it's not only for now, but it's for a future period when hopefully things will be slightly better on the economic front. So thank you. Speaking against this statement is Franziska. So Franziska, I'd like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much again. And yes, no wonder I oppose this statement. And I just want to remember that Commissioner Reynders introduced this legislative initiative as a response to the COVID-19 crisis. That legislation should actually be a means to build resilient supply chains, to build back better. So due diligence actually is a tool to help companies to actually prevent crisis, to prevent harm due to climate change, due to human rights violations. So actually with due diligence, companies will eventually produce more efficiently and more effectively. They do not have to fear and pay the price for any foreseeable cost due to exploitation abroad. And which company wants to actually produce at the expense of workers and other human beings, at least in the long run? So I would say the price has to be paid by all of us. And I think this is not only a question of bad moral conscience, but of good calculations. Or what else should be the reasons that kick the German companies who was held accountable, or who was brought before court after a fire in its textile factory in Pakistan with more than 300 dead people, is now actively actually speaking in favor of a German law for mandatory human rights due diligence. So human and environmental due diligence is not an extra financial burden, but these are costs to factor in, such as we had this before, sewing machines or other products. And who wants to live on exploitation? And it doesn't not only mean some human rights violations or some exploitations in your own supply chains. Sometimes the matter is a whole destruction of agricultural industry, such as the cocoa industry in the Ivory Coast, where farmers are not able to pay anymore to produce below a living income. And if it comes to extra financial burden, actually financial civil liability would be a good way to avoid such costs, to reduce the administrative burden. So what we want is actually a well-defined due diligence duty regarding foreseeable damage in compliance with a proportionate risk analysis and proportionate preventive measures. And if the European industry is not ready for this, how will European industry be able to prepare for the future for a just, sustainable human economy? Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. Okay, so it's about proportionate measures, but it's also about the kind of ethical stance that we have about recognizing as companies and as consumers that we don't want to be part of exploitation, and we don't want to be supporting that and encouraging that. Pascal, you have a chance now to react.
Non, mais je pense qu'on n'est pas tellement en désaccord. C'est-à-dire que le fait qu'il ne faille pas, parce qu'il y a la crise sanitaire, considérer que les questions de droits humains, de droits environnementaux, etc., doivent être abandonnées, je suis tout à fait d'accord. Je dis simplement que lorsque nous sommes en période de crise, lorsque nous avons des entreprises de différentes tailles et de différents niveaux, il faut savoir accompagner, il faut savoir raison garder pour mettre en œuvre une législation, pour qu'une bonne législation soit efficace, il faut qu'elle soit partagée, il faut qu'on puisse se l'approprier, et donc il faut prendre le temps. Je ne dis pas qu'il ne faut pas la faire maintenant, je dis simplement, et comme l'a dit M. Reynders, c'est aussi effectivement le moment pour réfléchir. Comment on peut éviter d'autres crises à l'avenir si les entreprises peuvent jouer leur rôle. Tout ça est très important, la question de la souveraineté européenne, etc., etc. Tout ça sont des sujets majeurs. Je ne dis pas qu'il ne faut pas réfléchir, je dis que nous devons accompagner intelligemment, de manière pragmatique, cette législation qui est une législation nouvelle et qui donc, comme toute législation nouvelle, doit vraiment bien s'être implantée et appropriée par l'ensemble des acteurs.
Exactly. So we might need a bit of patience whilst we give some time for some companies to adapt to this, understanding that the COVID-19 crisis has caused some problems for several people. Franziska, do you want to react on that?
Yes, thank you very much. And I, of course, agree that proportionality is an important legal principle also of human rights law that we have to observe. Nevertheless, I think I just want to make clear that in principle, all countries should be included in a future due diligence legislation, because also SMEs, small and medium-sized companies, have that responsibility, and they are able to actually do or take due diligence measures. In Germany, we have a lot of small and medium-sized companies who are already doing exerting due diligence. We have that VD, for example, or other textile companies. And also, I want to remind you that the UNGP, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, they say that all companies should take human rights due diligence measures. Of course, then if it comes to the actual measures to be taken, this is under the proportionality principle, and that will depend, of course, on the risk, on the severity of the human rights violations, then of course of the leverage of the company, and this is already built in the UN Guiding Principles. So I think we don't. It is not necessary to actually exclude before taking those measures SMEs from any sort of human rights due diligence. We should include them, but then of course, when applying human rights due diligence, then the principle of proportionality applies.
Thank you, Francisca. Okay, so we're back to the question of proportionality and how do we adapt the measures for the company and for the situation. Pedro, I'd like to give you a chance to comment on the third statement and on the discussions that you've heard so far.
So I think I could agree on a few things that have been said so far. So and to reply directly to Francisca, I mean, European industry is open to a due diligence legislation, but it has to be workable. So, and to be workable, there's a few conditions, as I mentioned in my initial statement, that need to be met. We agree with you on the proportionality. So proportionality is actually very important. The risk-based approach, targeted. So there's a few things from our perspective that are required to make it happen. Of course, the current pandemic is not making the lives of companies very easy. So every day we are confronted with our members telling us how the level of insolvencies are going to, that we'll see a wave of insolvencies later this year, as soon as the state backing up is going to run out. And that is very, very unfortunate. And companies, I mean, also have seen their supply chains in a disarray. They have not have the methods and the elements to continue their production. Difficulty to find everything that is required to their normal operations. So, I mean, COVID-19 is definitely a challenge, and a due diligence framework, as any other framework at EU level that is put up in front of companies in the next year or two, of course, it will make the life more complicated, because you will have to redefine some of the ways that you are working, and this takes time. This takes and might divert as well from the core business of how companies operate. And let me be just a little bit provocative. I cannot resist, but to be able to rebuild and to be resilient, to have resilient supply chains, you need to have companies. And as we stand now with the COVID-19, many of those companies will not exist in the coming months. And this is really unfortunate.
Thank you, Pedro, for weighing in on some of those points there about how legislation needs to be workable and needs to be paced at a frequency that companies can actually adapt to. Francisca or Pascal, would you like to give any concluding statements on this debate?
Maybe just a quick one. Yes, of course, it is unfortunate that companies suffer from this crisis, but I think it's actually in that last EU study on human rights due diligence, there it is put, and there has been some research on this, that actually companies who already are doing human rights due diligence have been found more resilient, and they take better care of their supply chains, and they were able to better go through the crisis. So I think the sooner we start.
You mean the study that was published before the crisis was there? Because the study is from February 2000, and it's before the crisis hit. So
no, sorry, that was the impact assessments from summer, a late study. Yes.
Okay.
And there was sorry, yes, no, yes, no, that was actually stated in the impact assessment, and a certain yes, there was some research, and a certain percentage have been found actually to be better or to be better prepared for the crisis, because they already took due diligence measures.
Thank you, Francisca. Yeah, that's an interesting point to factor in as well, that how do things like sound due diligence processes reflect the broader health, if we can say, of our companies. Okay, so now we're at the end of the third statement. I'd like to reopen the poll to see how our participants feel, having heard all of the sides of the arguments about statement number 3. So let's see as the votes come in. I'm going to close the vote. So similar kind of percentages. Previously, we had 47% who were in favour, and this has shrunk down a little bit to 38%, and slightly more people are indeed against the statement. So perhaps there is a chance for us to put this legislation in the broader picture than just the current situation of the COVID-19 crisis and the economic crisis that's linked to that. I'm going to close the poll now. The speakers will be glad to hear that the official debate part has now come to an end. It's true that the statements we chose were deliberately a bit provocative, and as some of you pointed out, of course, the situation is not quite so clear-cut and black and white, but we wanted to put you a bit on each side and see the kind of arguments that would come out. So thank you for that. What we're going to do now is open up to a slightly broader Q&A. So now, of course, you're free to speak exactly on the line that you would like to take. There's no for or against that you need to follow. I can see that we've got a couple of questions already that have come in from the audience, so I would just take this straight away. From Anna, and this is directed to Franziska and to Pascal primarily. Was the German Bundestag entitled to condemn the BDS movement and even to describe it as anti-Semitic? The BDS movement adopts a legal and analytical framework based on international law. Shouldn't democratic states and national authorities uphold and respect the right to boycott as part of the right to freedom of expression? Franziska, do you want to come in on this case?
I'm sorry, no, this is not my field of expertise. Yes, and I think Oxfam doesn't have an official position, or I would have to, yeah, no, sorry.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Pascal, would you like to come in on this question?
Non, je ne souhaite pas répondre à cette question-là, parce que déjà, on m'a donné un certain nombre de questions que j'ai dû défendre en vain, donc je ne vais pas en plus aborder la question du BDS et de l'antisémitisme. La question du devoir de vigilance est une question suffisamment, je vais dire, importante pour ne pas aborder la question du BDS et de la situation en Israël et dans les territoires occupés, qui est également une question importante, bien sûr, mais à mon avis, qui n'est pas directement liée à celle du devoir de vigilance. Donc, je préfère là rester sur la question du devoir de vigilance. Et par ailleurs, je ne ferai évidemment aucun commentaire sur le Bundestag, qui est souverain en tant que Parlement allemand. Moi, je suis parlementaire européen. Et donc, j'essaye de ne pas commenter les décisions des parlements nationaux, qui sinon vont venir chez nous pour commenter les nôtres.
Very good. Okay, in that case, let's move on to the next question. There's a question from Victor, who asks, is there a due diligence label, for example, like the eco label, that companies could show on their website? For example, if they comply with the legislation, and if this doesn't exist, do you think this could be implemented at the EU level? Perhaps Pascal, you would like to answer that.
Merci beaucoup. Très, très brièvement, déjà pour avoir un label sur une législation, il faut avoir une législation. C'est une lapalissade, mais c'est le point de départ. C'est-à-dire que là, dans la discussion qu'on a eue tout à l'heure, et c'est en ça, c'est toujours intéressant cette discussion-là, mais on fait comme si la législation était déjà acquise, était déjà en place et que finalement tout ça était simple à organiser. Non, nous avons à peine 2 législations européennes sur le devoir de vigilance à ce stade. Elles ont d'ailleurs démontré qu'elles avaient des failles et par ailleurs sur certains aspects elles marchaient bien. On est donc dans une période de transition, de mise en œuvre. Donc, ce qui est très important, et ça, on a la même chose pour le reporting non financier. Il faut qu'on arrive à avoir des normes qui soient les mêmes pour toutes les entreprises. C'est-à-dire que la question de la sécurité juridique est une question absolument majeure. Et donc, oui, nous devons arriver à avoir une législation qui soit une législation commune. Et par ailleurs, et là, c'est l'Européen engagé que je suis qui le répète, ça serait bien qu'on ne recommence pas l'erreur que nous avons commise sur la question des normes comptables. Les normes comptables nous sont arrivées des États-Unis et elles se sont imposées au monde entier et on a dû les respecter, en gros, sans avoir notre mot à dire. il serait très important que les normes autour des questions environnementales, des droits humains, soient des normes européennes. C'est-à-dire que nous soyons à l'origine de cette nouvelle législation, qu'on l'implémente et qu'on la rende obligatoire. C'est un des combats, évidemment, que nous menons, qu'on la rende obligatoire pour toutes les entreprises qui opèrent en Europe, même si elles ne sont pas au départ des entreprises européennes, de manière à ne pas porter, je vais dire, préjudice aux entreprises européennes qui respecteraient cette législation. Donc, l'extraterritorialité européenne est quelque chose de très important. C'est une nouvelle pratique. Donc, voilà, pour répondre très brièvement, oui, il faut qu'il y ait, je vais dire, une lisibilité pour les entreprises qui respectent. Pour cela, il faut d'abord qu'on ait la législation. Donc, M. Reynders donne au Parlement et au Conseil cette nouvelle directive, qu'on la discute, qu'on la débatte, qu'on la vote, et ensuite qu'elle soit implémentée dans l'ensemble des pays de l'Union.
Thank you. Okay, Pedro, so let's imagine that this legislation has been put in place. I know that, of course, that's the first step. Do you think that's something that's feasible for companies to have a kind of label that they would need to meet certain criteria and that they would then be able to place this on their products or on their website?
Labels present always a bit of challenges, of course. I mean, because you need to take account of who are they addressed to? Is it to the wider audience? How the wider audience, this targeted audience, how will they read it? What is the criteria? Who is going to define how to attribute the label? Is it an European label? Is it a member state label? Is it going to be issued by private entities? What is the governance? Who is going to control? Who is going to pay for the control? So when faced with questions about a label regarding due diligence, I mean, all these questions play in the mind of business. So I think some of these questions need to be answered. But I just wanted to add that there are already some sort of certifications or let's say self-regulatory certifications that are out there for a few sectors, if I'm not mistaken. So there's some effort in that direction without having legislation. So this is already happening. Of course, the scale of due diligence, future due diligence at EU level will be a whole different game, because it will probably enlarge to a lot of pieces of legislation. One last thing to address something that Mr. Durand has mentioned, the level playing field, because how can you have a label if, and that's something that we will not like to see in a legislation, if the member states will have the freedom to adopt anything they want on top of the European due diligence framework. So if we would have subsequent layers of legislation, this will not lead to a level playing field, and it would make the label completely unusable and for the users.
Thank you, Pedro. Francisca, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually agree with Pedro this time. I think that compliance with human rights is not a question of a label, and we need mandatory legislation first to actually address all companies. And then in case, if that's already done, then there could maybe be a label could be introduced, maybe. But that would be the top of the iceberg. And then to add on this, we have many bad experiences with labels, actually, with existing voluntary labels. We did in Costa Rica and Ecuador in the banana and pineapple plantations. A lot of plantations were actually labeled by various labels, including Rainforest Alliance. And these plantations were not much better than other plantations. So they had the similar sort of really horrible human rights violations were happening. So a label doesn't mean that it's really in that label what is on the label. So the label often doesn't, or conditions often not live up to what labels are promising.
So labels
Est-ce que juste ajouter un mot,
yes,
parce que puisque là tout le monde est d'accord, on a simplement ajouté le débat qu'on est en train d'ouvrir est un débat qui va avoir lieu au Parlement et qui aura lieu après au Conseil sur le caractère obligatoire ou non de la législation. C'est une question absolument majeure. Le commissaire Didier Reynders en a fait, j'allais dire, un point dur de sa future directive, et il a affirmé à maintes reprises qui voulait une législation obligatoire. Le débat qui est ouvert là, hein, et sur lequel je me réjouis de voir que nous sommes tous d'accord, c'est celui de savoir si finalement on laisse les entreprises s'auto-organiser sur un certain nombre de déclarations, et on sait ce que ça donne. Hein. Ça donne 1500 types de reports différents sur la question du non-financier, du reporting non-financier. On a 1500 types de rapports. Donc, on n'arrive pas à avoir une unité. Les ONG ne peuvent pas contrôler les déclarations. Les entreprises les plus vertueuses se trouvent opposées à des déclarations plus ou moins faussées d'un certain nombre d'entreprises, elles qui ne le sont pas. Voilà. Donc, c'est très important qu'on arrive à avoir des normes et que ces normes soient obligatoires et les mêmes pour tout le monde. Mais c'est un vrai sujet, hein, il va y avoir beaucoup de débats autour de cette question.
Very good to hear. That's what we're here. That's what we're here for today as well, to debate these questions. So let me then pose the counter question, which would be that if the legislation would not be obligatory, what other ways might there be, for example, to incentivize companies to adhere to these principles without having obligatory legislation? Pedro, is that something you would like to offer an opinion on?
Can you repeat the question, Lauren?
So Pascal mentioned that one of the core questions in developing the legislation is about whether or not it should be obligatory for companies to apply. He says very strongly that he thinks it should be. If the legislation, on the other hand, were not to be obligatory, and we said that we could think of other ways to have incentives, perhaps for companies to stick to the line without having legislation, how would you react to that?
I mean, if it's a legislation, it's obligatory. There's some level of obligations. The question is, what is the degree of obligations? What will be the legal liability? I think these are the major questions that we are faced with in the coming months before we will see a proposal. What I can tell you is that, I mean, companies, they are trying to address the issues in the value chains. They are adhering to the UN guiding principles. Maybe not in a satisfactory way that Francisco or Mr. Duran would like to see it, but companies and Europe is not starting from zero on these questions. I mean, we have seen due diligence being adopted in different sectors. Mr. Duran mentioned a few sectors are more sensitive than others, but we've seen at least 4 different initiatives that have been taken in the last months on top of the conflict minerals. So it's not that the EU is starting from zero. Many companies are already and will be already without the general framework already covered by some sort of legislation. And the big question is, how will this legislation look like? And I go back to my initial statement, it needs to be workable.
Yeah, thank you. Pascal, did you want to reply to that?
Non, juste pour approuver ce qui vient d'être dit sur le fait qu'on ne part pas de zéro et qu'il y a effectivement des entreprises et qu'il faut s'inspirer de ce que font certaines entreprises, bien sûr. Les ONG travaillent déjà avec des grandes entreprises sur des questions aussi importantes que la déforestation, par exemple, et l'exploitation de l'huile de palme. Greenpeace a fait un travail très important avec Nestlé, par exemple, donc avec des grands groupes. Il y a un travail qui a été fait. Une législation ne doit pas partir de rien. Il ne s'agit pas de partir d'une feuille blanche, mais il s'agit de faire en sorte que ces bonnes pratiques, que ces pratiques existantes, mais qui ne répondent pas à toutes les questions, hein, il n'y a qu'à aller voir la situation des peuples indigènes au Brésil pour voir si en l'état l'autorégulation des entreprises fonctionne. Évidemment, non, ça ne fonctionne pas partout, ça fonctionne pour certaines entreprises et dans certains endroits. Donc, il est très important qu'on s'inspire de ces bonnes pratiques, qu'on entende ce que disent ces entreprises, parce que ces entreprises nous demandent d'avoir une législation qui les mette justement dans une concurrence qui soit non faussée. Parce que rien n'est pire, quand vous mettez des feux rouges, d'avoir des gens qui respectent les feux rouges et qui s'arrêtent, et de voir des entreprises qui, elles, pourraient brûler les feux rouges sans aucune sanction. Parce qu'évidemment, c'est comme si vous prenez le ballon à la main au football. Ça ne marche pas s'il n'y a pas un arbitre pour vous dire non, attendez, les règles sont les mêmes pour tout le monde. Donc, moi, je suis d'accord avec ce que vient de dire M. Oliveira. Il faut absolument prendre en compte les bonnes pratiques et ce qui se passe et ce qui est possible de faire, mais en même temps, il faut que ça soit, et c'est la sécurité juridique qui veut cela, et puis, j'allais dire tout simplement la capacité de pouvoir peser dans le concert mondial. Il faut que l'Europe impose des normes à toutes les entreprises, mais qu'elle ne le fasse pas, encore une fois, en ne tenant pas compte des réalités du terrain et des entreprises. Et c'est en ça où il faut que le dialogue soit un dialogue de l'ensemble des parties prenantes. Et je le répète, ça ne pourra se construire que si les entreprises sont en dialogue avec les ONG, avec les syndicats et avec les consommateurs, bien sûr, de manière à ce que le législateur, finalement, entende tout le monde. Et nous, on a besoin d'avoir toutes les positions pour pouvoir prendre des lois qui soient applicables. Je répète, qui soient possibles.
Yep, thank you. I'd like to come back to one of the points you raised, Pascal, about how this is an opportunity for Europe to take the lead a bit in shaping some of the norms that have previously perhaps been shaped by other global powers. And I wanted to ask Franziska, especially given your experience outside of Europe, how do you think that Europe can take the lead in setting a good example with this legislation?
Yes, by just doing it, I would say. I mean, of course, it will help companies to actually prepare, as I said, for a sustainable human future. And it will help European companies to actually deal with their suppliers, with other business relationships, with their subsidiaries, to work better with their subsidiaries, and to prepare for future crisis, to actually get prepared in order to address climate change, in order to address other other natural or human disasters. Yes, to actually get ready and take the lead. I mean, we have seen this. I mean, suppliers in South Africa, in Costa Rica, and Ecuador, in India, they're actually looking to Europe, and they, yes, they're expecting, yes, to actually get helped to raise living standards and to prevent human rights violations. And our partners, especially as well, our NGO partners, people who we work with, trade unions, communities, they look with interest to Europe, and they yes, they wait for a good law to be implemented. And actually, with regard to their national action plans on business and human rights as well, the German action plan has raised a lot of interest in India, for example. So I think, yes, Europe should go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, so there's also the angle of Europe having perhaps a role and maybe even a responsibility to help raise living standards around the world through our companies, through trade, and so on. Okay, we're drawing to an end now. I don't see any more questions that have come in from the Q&As, but they're still open just in case any of our participants want to add something. Otherwise, I would be interested to turn more now specifically to the legislation that's coming up. And I would like to ask each of you what you think is, if you had to say, the single most important aspect or the single most important element of the upcoming legislation for you or for your organization, and what you would like to see. Perhaps we can start with Pedro.
I think I said many things about what we would expect as business community on this. I mean, I could give you a list of maybe 20 different conditions or elements that would be very important for us to see there to make it applicable. But I would just leave it at something that I said 2 or 3 times, that it needs to be a workable legislation.
And if I were to challenge you a bit, what is the main factor for you that determines whether or not it's workable?
I mean, it's a group of things. I mean, it's about the scope, it's about the level of prescription, about the definitions, about that this is not only about EU legislation, it should be an holistic EU approach. If the EU wants to have a leading role, it cannot be only on the basis of legislation, it needs to be more holistic as well. So maybe you can leave it under those terms.
Okay, so the scope of the legislation and having a holistic approach. Thank you, Pedro.
Yep,
Franziska, what would be the single most important aspect for you? I think you might be muted.
Okay, sorry for this. So there has to be a critical mass of companies to be covered. So SMEs should in principles be covered. Then there has to be civil liability. This is less bureaucratic. The EPR, the international private law, needs to be changed. There needs an overriding mandatory provision so that actually European law is applicable. And then the whole supply chain in principle needs to be covered. And then, of course, there can be proportionality applied when doing human rights due diligence. So 3 elements: the critical mass of companies, civil liability, and in principle, the whole supply chain needs to be covered.
Thank you, Franziska. And Pascal, to conclude for you, what would be the single most important aspect of this legislation?
L'élément le plus important, c'est un élément politique, c'est de considérer qu'au XXIe siècle et dans le moment où nous entrons, les questions environnementales et les questions humaines sont à mettre au même niveau d'importance que les questions de commerce traditionnel, les questions de profit. C'est vraiment l'objet de cette loi, c'est de dire on ne peut pas impunément importer, vendre et commercer au prix de la vie d'êtres humains, comme on l'a vu avec des milliers d'ouvrières à Dakar, comme on le voit tous les jours au Brésil, en Indonésie ou ailleurs. Donc, c'est vraiment le fait de dire nous avons tous une responsabilité partagée pour faire en sorte que ces sujets, les sujets environnementaux, les sujets sociaux, les sujets humains d'une manière générale, soient au cœur de l'entreprise et du commerce actuel. C'est absolument majeur. J'allais dire que le reste se décline et ça veut dire que nous devons trouver les bons outils pour faire en sorte que ces sujets-là deviennent importants. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'il faut remettre en cause le commerce, ça ne veut pas dire que l'Europe doit se replier sur une espèce de forteresse fermée à l'extérieur, ça veut simplement dire que maintenant nous considérons, et c'est ce que j'ai essayé d'expliquer tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire que si un boulon dans un avion est quelque chose d'essentiel au commerce international et pour Airbus, eh bien moi je voudrais que la vie d'un enfant, que la vie d'un ouvrier, que la vie d'une ouvrière au Bangladesh ou ailleurs soit aussi importante dans la question du commerce ou de la commercialisation d'un produit. C'est ça la loi sur le devoir de vigilance et c'est ça que j'attends. Après, pour le reste, effectivement, ça se décline. À qui on l'applique, comment on l'applique, quelle est la responsabilité. Tout ça se travaille. Mais le principe général, c'est les droits humains et les droits environnementaux sont à minima au même niveau que les droits commerciaux traditionnels.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we are coming right to the end of our webinar today. We've heard a lot of interesting perspectives from all 3 of you, some that you believed wholeheartedly and some that we forced you to defend. But I think it's really important to remember that, as Pascal mentioned, this is an evolution. Europe is not starting from zero. There are already some structures in place, and this is a question of refining those and fine-tuning them. We heard that pragmatism will be needed, partly because Europe is still recovering from the pandemic and partly because companies have different sizes, different structures, and we need to be mindful of their ability to adapt to the new legislation. We heard also about the existing legal norms, some of the WTO rules that need to be factored in. I also took down that there's perhaps a moral element that Europe should be perhaps leading the way and showing an example on how we can be a continent that doesn't promote human rights abuses in any ways and make sure that our companies are leading a good example. There's probably many more elements to debate, but those we will see over the course of the next months, and I'm sure that the debate will continue in the European Parliament itself. So we'll closely be following that from the outside as well. And with that, I would like to thank very much Pascal, Pedro and Franziska for joining us today. I would like to thank also the European Coalition for Corporate Justice for putting us in touch and for reaching out to us on this topic. And just a sort of final reminder that for those of you following the work of the European Liberal Forum, we'll be having a webinar next week on Thursday, our On the Agenda webinar, where we'll be talking about the e-privacy directive. So we'll be looking forward to seeing many of you there as well. So thank you very much all. Have a great day and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.